I can tell you, provided there are no architects on the panel, I feel quite safe here. We're also very nervy about doing things with Jeremy Hunt for completely different reasons, and of course, it's nothing personal. Thanks very much, John. I know the real reason I'm here. I didn't know you really wanted John Humphreys to come, but I was setting up a charity event the other day, a minor thing of my own, and I discovered you've got to book John 6 months in advance if you want him. For Mishal Hussain, the new and great star of the Today programme, newsreader, of course, as well. It's a year, I discovered. And for Jim Nocte, who is at every literary festival, I'm sure is somewhere in another tent. Gone off mic. I'm back again. You've got to book Jim 18 months ahead of your event to have any hope of getting him. Anyway, so when, John, you rang me this morning and asked me if I was free, imagine how delighted I was to find that I was able to attend. So basically, I'm going to take very little part. I'm deliberately not sitting in the middle. It's not a mistake, because this isn't intended to be an adversarial debate in that sense. And it's certainly not a Today-style debate where I do all the talking and they just, and at the end of it we say, I'm afraid it's time for the weather. Though I will say that at 4 o'clock. So without further ado, what I wanted to start by doing, and I've told everyone this, is just get a sense of where they're coming from. No more than that. A couple of minutes or so, or even less if they prefer, and then we'll have a conversation. Then we will really genuinely throw it open. We have people with microphones, so after an hour or so, to give a good sort of 20 minutes of anyone else who wants to take part. So let's just come all the way down and start with you at the end, Dan. You are, I mean, the question is Europe, yes or no, and in many respects, you're Europe, yes, aren't you?
Oh, Europe, yes. I mean, I speak French, I speak Spanish, I've lived and worked all over the continent. My problem is with the bureaucracy in Brussels, and my problem is with finding ourselves in the wrong place in a changing world. The year that we joined the European Economic Community, the then 9 members, counting us, accounted for 36% of the world economy. Today, the 28 members account for 17% and falling. And this is a problem for this reason. I don't know whether anybody saw the Chancellor of the Exchequer's trip to China last week. It was written up as a trade mission, a trade negotiation. But Britain, and even now, after more than 40 years of membership, this is not widely appreciated, Britain cannot sign an independent trade agreement with China or with anyone else. The EU speaks and votes for us in the WTO, as it has since 1973. Now, when we think that China, with all the news about the slowdown, grew at 6.1% this year, is supposed to grow at 6.5% next year, whereas the Eurozone has flatlined for 6 years, I would say that puts us in the wrong place. The EU has suspended its free trade talks with India. But EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, they expect to sign a comprehensive free trade agreement with India this year. Now, which of those arrangements would suit us better? Is there a country in this part of the world that stands to gain more from unrestricted commerce with that rising giant than us? You know, India is English-speaking, at least for business purposes, common law. There are 1.4 million Brits of Indian origin. It's the 4th largest investor here, but we can't sign a free trade agreement with India because Italian textile workers don't want the competition and so on. Basically, we are in the wrong place. We don't sit on great natural resources in this damp, green, exquisite island of ours. We have to make our way in the world by what we buy and sell. Our trade with the EU is diminishing virtually by the minute. 20 years from now, it's going to seem bizarre that we were having this argument about whether to merge our political system with the rest of the EU in order to have a say over what might then be just, quarter, a fifth of our total exports? At what point do we realize that we have to raise our eyes to more distant horizons and rediscover that global vocation that previous generations took for granted?
Richard.
Well, I guess I just wanted to say one thing first that everyone on the panel and in the audience is going to agree with, that it's absolutely fantastic that we're having this referendum, and it's a really exciting, unique opportunity. We're going to get once in our lifetimes, and it's not politics here. This is humanity, we as a nation getting to decide. Every single vote has equal power. There's no sort of swing marginal seats that sort of hold the tip of the balance. So I think irrespective of what you think, we can all agree it's brilliant that we're getting this opportunity. And I think we should all invest as much time as possible to properly understand the argument so we have a firm view. Because at the end of the day, we will be going into those little booths, and there will be only two choices: either stay in or come out. And that is inarguable. That is the choice architecture. You've got to choose. Neither are perfect, but it's either in or out. Now, as you said, I'm massively, unconditionally, hugely in. It's based on my personal experience. You know, I'm a guy from Yorkshire that moved down to London to make my fortune. I'm kind of like a modern-day Dick Whittington. I did so by setting up a stall at a music festival selling smoothies from it. And myself and two friends were happy with the way that stall went. We gave up our jobs on the Monday morning and then set about building a company called Innocent full-time. And 15 years later, we went from three guys from a market stall to a business that's turning over hundreds of millions of pounds, trading with 17 countries across Europe. And without the EU, without the unfettered access to what is the world's largest market, we just wouldn't have been able to achieve it. In fact, back in 2008, we probably would have gone bust. So I personally have a lot to thank the EU for, and the ability that we can trade with it entirely freely and without any sand in the machine. But it's also been absolutely, if you take Innocent as one example, a brilliant thing for the UK economy. More than 50% of the products we sell into continental Europe. But more than 80% of the people that we employ here in the UK. So we're selling the products over here, selling the products over there, but creating the jobs over here. And I guess people in the audience might be thinking, okay, good for you, that worked for Innocent. But when you're an entrepreneur in the UK, you tend to meet other entrepreneurs. And I have a cohort of pretty much every single consumer-facing brand you can think of that's been started in the UK over the last 20 years, from Richard Branson with Virgin, to Nick Jones that set up Soho House, to Julie Metcalf that did Protomenge, to Tyrrell Crisp, to SoundCloud, to Deliveroo, to Mixcloud, to pretty much anything that's been a joyful, consumer-facing brand creation and a success story. Every single one of my fellow entrepreneurs is also unconditionally, clearly, yes for staying in. And I think that's got to say something where the entrepreneurs of this country say, we are much better being part of the EU than coming out of it.
Minette, speak for the farmers. You're going to be on the fence, I suspect.
We have many members right across England and Wales, 55,000 farmer members. Many will want to stay in, many will want to come out. So for us, it's about gathering an evidence base. We've produced a document looking at what we want and the questions that we want answered for what it would look like out of the EU. But our overriding priority is food security. You know, I think it's worth pointing out, and I'd like everybody here to sort of think about, you know, we have a really large population. We have 65 million people to feed in this country, set to rise to 75 million over the next decade. We have only less than 1% of farmers producing food for that 65 million. So I think being an island nation, having really sound, strong food policies, knowing what it's going to be like. Remember, no member state has ever left the EU. We don't know what it looks like. But the priority for us is making sure that our farmers are not disadvantaged and that food is really a priority in this discussion.
Nick Clegg.
So, I mean, we're obviously at the foothills of this debate, and we're all of us here, we're all going to be bombarded and bamboozled and no doubt somewhat bewildered by a sort of tsunami wave of claims and counterclaims and statistics and counter-statistics between now and the referendum. So I think at this stage, I would suggest that it's worth just sort of looking at some of the fundamentals. First one I would point out is that, you know, the world has changed utterly. It is unrecognizable to the days where Great Britain was able to shape its own destiny on its own terms without having to rely on cooperation with other countries. One of the realities of power and of governance in a globalized age is that you simply cannot, we certainly can't in the United Kingdom, provide the safe streets, safe from cross-border crime, the clean water and clean air from the pressures of climate change, the investment into our factories, the export opportunities to our near neighbors in Europe. We can't stand tall in the world unless we stand tall in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, other than by working with other countries. So that the simple idea that you get more done for us, it's not altruism, for us, by working with others, I think is a very important principle in the modern age. Secondly, and related to that, our economy has become, the very fabric of our economy, has become inextricably tied up with the sort of heft of the European economy. About half of what we produce and export goes, of what we export goes to the rest of the European Union. About £26 billion of investment comes from Europe into the United Kingdom. The CBI estimates around 3 million people's jobs are in one way or another dependent on our position within what is the world's, it might be flawed, but it is nonetheless the world's largest borderless marketplace. Why on earth would we jeopardize all of that just as the country is recovering from this near heart attack that we experienced back in 2008? I really, it escapes me. And third and finally, and John Witherow hinted at this, my own view is that if we do come out of the European Union, it'll have a bigger transformative effect on who we are, who the United Kingdom, Britain, than I think many people might appreciate right now. First and most obviously, because we'll not only pull out of one union, the European Union, we'll almost certainly lose our own union of the United Kingdom as Scotland then leaves what remains of the United Kingdom. But then what? Then particularly for those of us in England, we end up, I think, the risk at least, is we end up drifting somewhat friendlessly somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, less relevant to world affairs, less open in many ways to the world as well. And that's certainly not a fate that I would like to see for our Great Britain.
Thank you very much. David Owen.
In 1975, in the referendum, the Yes campaign, of which I was a member, said that the threat of European monetary union had been removed. Would that it had been. Of course, things have changed. We have now a Eurozone, which is obviously flawed. Even the present government has had to say that the only way that the Eurozone can be improved and hopefully its problems solved is by having that fundamental change of moving towards greater integration, having a fiscal transfer union, voting almost all the time by qualified majority vote, and having a block vote. I think that is correct, but if you do that, you're on an escalator towards a federal Europe unless the British government changes its position and goes for a fundamental restructuring of Europe. That means a Eurozone, which must have those freedoms, and Britain must be ready to give it. But on the other hand, there has to be a non-Eurozone, recognized as such, with protections against block votes, able to not be an integrated Europe, able to have opt-outs, and able to control its own borders and its own future. Still within the single market, which is an important advance and has, as has been said by a number of people, produced considerable successes. The only way to do that is to recognize that we do have a single market which is not just the 28 European Union countries, but is actually 31. It has Norway, it has Iceland, and has little Liechtenstein. But these countries are not freestanding members. They have no votes. They need votes, and we need to encourage other European countries, not within either the European Union or the EEA, as it's called, the economic area, to be able to come in, to be able to vote. And in that voting context, then there has to be a reserve, if you like, for the non-EU countries that they can block the Eurozone if it's taking actions which threaten them within the single market. Now, that's sort of fundamental restructuring, not impossible to achieve. The economic area is a viable entity. It ought to expand. But for countries coming in, like, for example, Turkey and some other countries, there should not be free movement of labor. That is not an essential for a single market. It is essential for the Eurozone. And that opens up a new Europe. It's not, as I say, immensely complicated because the separation of the treaties has already been achieved. If we were to do that, then I could see Europe with a future. I'm a lifelong European. I've supported it, voted for it at every stage. But at the moment, this status is not capable of going on as it is. And if we are not faced with a serious restructuring of Europe, then we will have very little option, in my view, other than to vote to leave.
David, thank you very much. Can we delve a little deeper into this trade business, first of all? You hear this endlessly discussed on the Today programme. We never get anywhere. And at the end of all of our remarks about them, Dan Hannan usually issues a formal complaint to the BBC because of something, often, I'm sure, quite rightly. But when it comes to trade, can you convince Richard, Dan, that he will be able to sell his smoothies and future entrepreneurs will be able to sell their stuff to a Europe that we're not members of?
Yes, because if you look at the European continent, you see a free trade area that stretches from Iceland and the Faroe Islands through to Turkey. It has some 45 states and territories, of which 28 are members of the EU, the others are not. The only European countries that have chosen to exclude themselves from a free movement, tariff-free, free movement of goods and services area are Belarus and Russia. I have never heard anyone in Brussels suggest that if Britain withdrew from some of the political institutions, the common rules on immigration, foreign policy, and environment, and so on, that we would be excluded from the single market. No one has suggested that except British Yes campaigners. And I'd like, if I may, to disagree with Nick on a few points, if you'll allow me. I mean, Nick used a rather deceptive phrase. He said, around half our exports go to the EU. Well, all right, around, but let's look at what the trend is. I looked this up just this morning while John was inviting you to chair our panel. So this is fresh from the Office of National Statistics as of this morning. In 2006, the EU was taking 64% of UK exports. In 2012, it was taking 44%. Right? Where are we going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Are we still going to be having this debate about having to throw everything into Europe for what by then will be a very small, diminished, dwindled part? Nick says we have to collaborate. Do you know, no one is against that. I have yet to meet anyone who says we shouldn't work with other countries. We can work with other countries globally without needing to invite European commissioners to run our affairs. There is not a single person who believes in some kind of atomized world where no country talks to any other, and indeed we have very good links across the continent. But I think the single biggest, even I'm not even going to get into the 3 million jobs nonsense, which has now been even disowned by the Brussels-funded think tank that first put it out there. The real area where I disagree with Nick was this idea that if we're not in the EU, we will be, in your words, Nick, Little England. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. We are the 4th military power on the planet. We're one of the group of 7 industrialized nations. We're one of 5 permanent Security Council members on the United Nations. Our language is the most widely spoken on Earth. We have unparalleled links with the United States, the Commonwealth. We have the best universities in Europe. How much bigger do we have to be before we're able to run our own affairs, living under our own laws, trading and collaborating with our friends and neighbors, but governing ourselves?
Nick, what happens to our trade? What is your fear about what happens to our ability to trade with Europe once we left, if we did? Because plainly we would still trade with Europe. What would we not be able to do?
So I think, let me try and, there's a very important technical distinction which is completely lost here. Interestingly, Dan has just conflated the two, which is between free trade and a single market. A free trade area and a single market. You've heard just Dan use them interchangeably. They are completely and utterly different, and it's very important why. A free trade agreement is basically where you reduce or eliminate the taxes, the levies, the tariffs on everything from chicken legs to plastic ducks that you trade with each other. A single market is something totally different. And by the way, the single market was created by, guess what, Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative government at the time, entering us in through the Single European Act into the single market created in the early 90s. And it is a revolutionary idea because it says, well, okay, we can reduce the taxes and the levies, which everyone, and Dan's quite right, everyone's doing that around the world anyway. But what we can, if we really want to boost trade, is we make sure that the consumer standards, the labeling regulations that your company no doubt needs to honor to export into France and Germany are basically the same across Europe. In other words, the rules are the same, so you don't all have to jump through 28 different kinds of rules to export into Europe. It's why agricultural exports from farmers in this country go effortlessly across the Europe. It's got nothing to do with tariffs anymore. That's the old debate of 20 years ago. It's the fact the rules are the same. Now, here's the really important thing, and this is where Dan, with respect, I think just willfully conflates these two things. You cannot be part of a single market and not abide by its rules. And you cannot enter into those rules without having your parliaments agree that you're going to accept those rules. So this idea of sort of untrammeled free trade, where everyone exports things but no one abides by the same rules, is simply not possible. So look, let's have a debate, and there's a perfectly forcefully held debate about leaving, but let's not pretend that there is a nice nice alternative in which we square the circle by having all the privileges of being part of a single market, but none of the rules.
Works for the Swiss.
That is simply
It works pretty well.
Hold on just a second. Let me put this to Richard. Richard, when you...
Can I just add one thing? Because there are a couple of countries which do have access to the single market, but aren't a member of it, like Switzerland and Norway. And guess what they call it in Norway? They call it fax democracy. The Prime Minister of Norway has said publicly the last thing we should do is emulate them, because they have to abide by all these rules that I alluded to, and they have no say about how they're written.
And
so far from gaining sovereignty, they lose sovereignty. So I say, let's have the debate about in or out.
And what are the opinion polls in Norway about membership, Nick?
Sorry?
What are the opinion polls in Norway about membership? 70.5% of Norwegians prefer this imperfect deal to what we have 17% wanted to go in. So plainly, some miserable existence is possible out there. They're getting by pretty well.
Sure. There's a wider point as well. I want to put this to Richard and then Minette. You have to abide by a country's rules when you export to it. We all understand that. But you have to do that around the world, presumably. When you export stuff to countries that are outside the European Union, you have to deal with their rules, their bureaucracy, etc. I mean, when you send one of your products to the United States or to wherever else, you must follow the rules that they have. Is there any difference, in your view, between the sort of rule following that you would have to do with Europe, and you do at the moment, and the sort of rule following that you do to any other country?
Yes, totally. I mean, funny if you, excuse me, you asked if Dan could convince me about, it would be just the same without it. And I'm afraid, with due respect, Dan, you haven't, and you struggled to convince me because you haven't done it. The reality is going out and doing business with countries when you have, as Nick says, one code of conduct for all countries, it just makes it simpler. It doesn't fundamentally change things. I'm not ever the guy that's sort of painting this doomsday if we come out. It just introduces a bit of sand into the machine. It just means you spend a bit more time faffing around with individual countries, individual issues and legislations, rather than just being able to go, there is this absolutely massive bunch of consumers that happen to be in different countries, but ultimately we're all the same anyway. We can trade with them as one entity rather than as 17 different ones. The amount of simplicity and efficiency that brings to a business is very powerful. And yes, we've looked at doing business with other countries. We made a choice. We did a big two-year analysis whether we were going to export to America or to the EU, and we chose the EU because it was simpler. America there was just more sand that was going to get into the machine. And just to finish on, and again, it's an anecdotal point about Switzerland, that people hang out and say this is the model to go for. I have a very beautiful, very talented, very hard-working Swiss girlfriend who has just moved from Geneva to London to set up her business, because setting it up in Switzerland to do business with the EU was just more faff and had more sort of things were getting in the way. She left her country to come here to this country to set up that business purely because it gave her the unfettered access to the biggest bunch of consumers in the world.
And you, of course.
Well, I really think it was more about the market.
Look, let's be a little careful about a lot of this stuff. Nick's been on many platforms when the Eurozone was a fashionable policy inside the Liberal Democrats, saying how disastrous it would be if we did not join the Eurozone. And the CBI, business, all argued why we had to go into the Eurozone. We would lose the City of London. Frankfurt would join all these things. They've been shown to be wrong, and they've been shown to be wrong for a simple reason. We're all trading, we're all selling. Germany is as keen to sell their cars into this country, and after what's happened to Volkswagen, even keener. And they will not say no to us offering them the chance of selling on an even, Steven basis of a single market into our country. And this idea that we will not be able to have a single market if we are driven out of it, and we will be driven out of it. It's up to them to renegotiate and restructure Europe because of what they have already done to Europe by coming into this Eurozone, creating this Eurozone. Look at its growth record. Look what happened to Greece. Look what will probably happen to Italy. Look at the unemployment rates. Under 25 since in Spain, 56% unemployment. We have, at this moment, as part of the European Union, a disaster, and it is getting worse. It has to be got better, and it's in our interest to get better because we sell into this market. Why shouldn't, Nick, the single market be extended to Norway, one of our closest friends and allies? What's wrong with all of Europe, the wider Europe, being part of a single market? Why shouldn't we try and encourage Turkey? We're desperate now for Turkey to do more about its borders, to police its borders. We want Turkey, after all, it's an associate. We've promised them actually membership of the European Union. We won't do it because of free movement of labor. That's the real reason why Turkey's not a member. They should certainly be part of a single market, and they should be voting. To say that Norway and Iceland shouldn't be voting seems to me to be a very inadequate view of what Europe is about.
All right.
We're only talking about part of Europe in the Eurozone.
Okay.
For farming, I mean, knowing whether we would have access to that European market and knowing what it looks like is absolutely essential. We're the largest producer of lamb, for instance, in the whole of the EU, so wholly reliant on that marketplace, which, of course, at the moment is very easily accessed. And trade agreements across the world. You know, a lot of what we've done actually has been about keeping other products out, and we'll be more open to imports. Certainly in the United States, you know, they still use growth hormones. That was banned, you know, over 20 years ago. So I think it's knowing how that marketplace would work. But for us, that EU has been essential, and we just don't know what it would look like outside.
Yeah. Is that, Dan, what's going to decide it in the end? The uncertainty?
Well, yes, what Milton Friedman calls the tyranny of the status quo. But I think you can get a fair glimpse of what it's like when you look at other developed Western European countries that are in a free trade-only relationship. Now, I want to go back to this Swiss option. It is perfectly true. Richard is quite right. Swiss companies must meet EU regulations when they sell to the EU, just as they must meet Japanese regulations when they sell to Japan, Indian regulations when they sell to India. They have nonetheless made the calculation that it is better not to have to apply those regulations to their domestic economy, nor to have to apply them to the non-EU part of their exports. And you know what? I can't help noticing that it's working pretty well. The United Nations does a league table of the wealthiest and happiest countries in the world. It looks at income, and then it also looks at literacy, longevity, infant mortality, and guess which country is the, well, in fact, guess which are the two best places in the world to be born? Norway and Switzerland. So plainly something is possible out there. Now, I have learned in these debates that it's an inexorable rule of public debate, that whenever you make a parallel with another country, however narrow and limited the context, you are guaranteed to be told an unrelated fact about that country. So you cite Switzerland, someone, oh yeah, well they took Nazi gold, or you know what. All right, if even Norway and Switzerland are too exotic as examples, how about the Channel Islands, okay? They speak English, they have the pound, they have the same head of state as us, they watch the same TV, the same streets. In fact, the only difference between the Channel Islands and the UK politically is the Channel Islands are not in the EU. And you know what? I can't help noticing that they are doing pretty well. So the idea that if 8 million Swiss, if 5 million Norwegians, 330,000 Icelanders, you know, a few thousand Guernseymen and Jerseymen are able, just with a trade relationship with the EU, to give their peoples such a high standard of living, way above ours or the EU average. The idea that we, a nation of 64 million trading, maritime people whose enterprising energies connect us to every continent and archipelago, the idea that we could not thrive independently, making our own laws without inviting Brussels to assume the government of this country, I just think is ludicrous and is defeatist.
Nick, brief one.
Look, if the measure is which nation is happy, I read some survey the other day saying that people in Mongolia are now apparently the happiest in. I don't think we're going to turn ourselves into Mongolia, yet alone Channel Islands or Norway. Look, the point about Norway, and let me give you some very relevant facts. Norway and Switzerland pay hundreds of millions of pounds of their taxpayers' money to have access to a single market, the rules of which they have to abide by, but over which they've got no control.
The Swiss contribution per capita is about 4% of ours.
Well,
4%.
Do you think that's a good idea?
No, hang on, let me just explain. So the point that you are making, the people who want to leave, is that we gain greater control. I'm not seeking to make judgments about the quality of life in Switzerland and Norway. I am seeking to make judgments about whether a great nation such as ours should give up not only control, sovereignty over the rules that govern the single market of which we're part, but also pay money into a club over which we then have no say. By the way, Switzerland and Norway, little known this, are also part of the Schengen Agreement, which we're not. So they don't even have control over their borders. So Switzerland and Norway, the great paragons of that life for Great Britain outside the European Union, have no control over their borders, no control over their laws, pay money into a club over which they've got no control. So what I don't understand is why pick two countries who have catastrophically lost control over their own fate as the model for us regaining control over ours. And my view is, which is of course why I come at this from quite a different angle, is however flawed the European Union is, of course it's flawed. So is Westminster, Whitehall, the United Nations, NATO. But we don't sort of hold a gun to our head and say, if you don't reform it exactly as we want, we're going to blow our own brains out with all of those organisations. You work hard to reform it. Of course it needs to be reformed, but I just don't think a nation such as ours can or will exercise leadership in our own European hemisphere unless we remain part of the club of that hemisphere.
Can I turn from... Can I turn, as it were, from heads to heart? And something that often occurs to me listening to people arguing about Europe, Dan, can I put it to you straight, that if all of the arguments, the practical arguments, the trading arguments, the legal arguments, etc., if they all seem to be balancing up against you, would you still, because of what your heart says, want to leave?
No. No,
You're
I've made a
pragmatic.
I've made a cost-benefit analysis, and I've looked not only at where the EU is now, but where it's trending. And we can see where it's going because its leaders keep telling us that they want it.
It's not a visceral thing about sovereignty, about having control of our own borders and our own selves. That's not it for you.
That's never been my argument about borders, no. There is an argument about democracy. I thought it was eerie to hear Jean-Claude Juncker saying there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. I thought it was unsettling to hear Commissioner Avramopoulos on Monday of this week saying the reason the European Commission can be so far-sighted about this migration issue is that we don't have to care about public opinion and new national governments should be as undemocratic as us. I think that is a slightly scary thing from the continent that introduced the world to the idea of parliamentary self-government. But that is not my primary reason for being better off outer. You know, I don't think the European Union is kind of some terrible monstrosity. I think we will be a little bit happier and a little bit wealthier if we leave and rejoin the rest of the world. And I come back to this basic... Based on the fact that actually, every continent on the planet is growing except Europe, and we are in the wrong place.
Can I put the same question to you? Robert, can you also answer it from the point of view, the standpoint, that if the arguments did stack up against you, are you just, you've got a girlfriend who's outside the European Union after all, and you're plainly a man who is willing to I was going to say look outside the European Union, a slightly indelicate way of putting it, but you know what I mean. You are someone who is open to the outside world. Are you still, is part of your commitment just this sort of visceral feeling that we need to be in this club?
Yeah, I think you've got, look, for anyone who knows the science of decision-making and how we are as human beings, we all carry within us biases, whether we like them or not. And yeah, I have a clear bias towards sort of optimism, the future, collaboration. I think the human race is a team sport. So yes, I have a personal bias to we're stronger together. But the informed position I take on this specific choice of in or out just comes down to ultimately and firstly the economy. This is why I find your position a slightly strange one, because you look at any independent think tank, you look at the voice of either big established business or entrepreneurial business, we are united in a view that GDP is going to go backwards. Yes, we are. What was amazing was even on Thursday, Norman Lamont, who I think was a pretty good chance of the Exchequer in his time, who is now the vice president of the Out campaign, he went on the record to say that he conceded that coming out would impact British business and would reduce Britain's standing in the world. And that's a guy that's saying we should come out.
Richard, you don't speak for every business. And I know when I see business lining up on this, and I see on the outside award-winning exporters like JCB and Dyson and Tate & Lyle, and then I see on the other side some of these disgraced mega banks and big corporates and vast multinationals. I know which of those is closer to the enterprising interests of this country. Don't pretend that you speak for the whole of business.
Oh, I didn't say that. I'm saying the majority of business. I mean, we can both quote logos, and I've got more logos than you've got logos, but the majority of UK businesses, both big and small, would rather stay in. The economic independent think tanks all say GDP will go backwards.
Right.
There's a bit of a debate whether it's -7 or -2.
We can come back to the trading
backwards.
business, and I'm sure people might want to bring it up, but I want to stick on this business of head and heart, David Owen. I mean, you were Foreign Secretary when you were a young boy, striding around the world representing Britain. Do you, hand on heart, feel that Britain is, as we've heard, and we heard certainly from Nick, best represented around the world by being part of this whole? Or could we hack it? Could we punch above our weight once again out of a club?
Well, it depends what are the rules of the club. When I was Foreign Secretary,
to simplify, let's assume the club, not the reformed club that you want, but the club pretty much as exists at the moment, and frankly will still almost certainly exist in December when we have our negotiations over.
Well, the club I was Foreign Secretary with, it was a country of 9 and then 15, and then I watched it very carefully for nearly 3 years in the Balkans, and it has changed. It wants to be, amongst some people, one country, hence open borders and the whole of Schengen. That is breaking up before our very eyes at this moment. It believed that you didn't need to be a country, as we would call it, a self-governing country. I believe that Britain should be European. We are part of Europe. We should be fully committed to it, but not to a country that has to develop to live within a single currency. There have been no single currencies anywhere in the world that have succeeded unless they have become a country. That is what is now facing us. Within the European Union, we are seeing an integrated federal Europe around the single currency. But there are parts of Europe which are not part of that, and we are part of it. And very few of these politicians who are utterly convinced all about Europe will rule out, at one stage, not going into the Eurozone.
But what happens to us if we're outside?
We're not outside. We stay within Europe, but we stay as independent, self-governing countries. Therefore, we do control our borders. Therefore, in the last analysis on foreign policy, we have the right not to go along with it. We are not going into qualified majority voting on foreign policy, nor, I hope, on defense. There are lots of clubs. NATO's a pretty good club, pretty effective club. It works by consensus. Of course, because it has America there, people have to take account of them because they pay 70% of the bills. This is an interrelated issue, actually, Europe and NATO. America's getting more and more fed up with paying the bills. Europe pretends that it can have a defense force. It creates a defense force out of the commitments it's already made to NATO. It plays cynically around pretending to have a foreign policy. What's Europe done about Ukraine? In many ways, the European Union-Ukrainian agreement was the issue that provoked what has actually happened in Ukraine. It was obvious to everybody that if you went down with the sort of language of that agreement, then you would get into problems with Russia, and we certainly walked into those problems. The idea that this Europe is all singing, all dancing Europe is a success in foreign policy or in defense policy. It couldn't agree on Libya, whether to go in or out. It was divided. It was divided on most of the main foreign policy issues of the last 20 years. And I think that we've got to be very careful. Coordination, cooperation. That was what we went into. It was called political cooperation when I was Foreign Secretary. You tried very hard to reach agreement on foreign policy. And that's a noble objective and ought to be one for Europe. But if you can't, in the last analysis, you remain a freestanding country. In our case, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Now, I don't see any reason for this defeatism that we've got to go along. Nick said it's flawed. By God, it's flawed. Those flaws since the euro currency came into being, it's a completely new feature. We're not talking about the same Europe. We, as I said, promised the British electorate in '75 that it wouldn't ever go into a European monetary union.
Can I turn to something that Nick touched on in his opening remarks, I think, and that is the impact of a decision to leave on the United Kingdom itself and on the makeup of the United Kingdom. And from the point of view of the NFU, do you have concerns about, in fact, what was your position during the Scottish referendum? What are your fears, what are your hopes as an organisation, or do you have a policy on the breakup of the EU, of the UK?
On Scotland, we took a neutral position. I think what really alarmed me with Scotland was that we were going to negotiate everything afterwards. And we absolutely cannot do that going into the EU referendum. You know, we are hugely fortunate to have that single market there, but we do not know what it would look like if we were outside it. And as far as global trade goes, you know, we need government, we need the Prime Minister championing British food right across the globe. You know, that isn't happening. You look at Ireland, that is wholly focused on getting everything out of Ireland. And, you know, Simon Coveney and the Irish Prime Minister, they are all over the globe championing that production. So that is what we would need. And that's a huge concern, because that certainly isn't happening at the moment. And we have advantages in that we have this massive, wonderful home market, but we can also export. And, you know, we are the largest manufacturing sector. You know, agriculture produces the raw ingredients for the food and drink industry, which is bigger than aerospace and cars put together. So it's a huge industry.
That is one of the things, isn't it, Dan, that people will fear. Not just what immediately happens in terms of trade, but that it sets off a chain reaction that one is no longer in control of. And that one of the first things, actually, that happens in that chain reaction is that Scotland votes to leave the UK.
I was partly involved in the Scottish campaign. I find it extraordinary that the SNP, which a year ago was urging Scots to vote to leave the EU as a consequence of leaving the UK, now, without a blush, turns around and says, well, of course, if the UK leaves, then that would be a trigger for another referendum.
They did think they could stay. I mean, they used to argue that they could stay.
There were good, patriotic, sincere people on both sides of that, as on this issue. But I find it difficult to imagine any voter in Scotland saying, well, I was for the union, but I'm so desperate to be allowed to join the euro that now I've switched my vote. I mean, such a person may exist, but I have yet to hear of him. I think we need to be empirical about this. I mean, Richard was saying, you know, we all have our biases and our intuitions, and of course that's true. But we also have the capacity to judge organizations by their record. Now, the two great props of the European project were the monetary union and the border-free zone. These were the things that were supposed to make us all better off, and were also supposed to make us get on better, to boost amity and collaboration among the member states. Now, look at what's happened. Extrapolate, infer from the record. Has the euro made people better off? As it has condemned millions across the Mediterranean to poverty and emigration, and millions more in Northern Europe to tax rises? Has the Schengen zone, with all that we now see, made the members, has it soothed or stoked national antagonisms? When we look at that record, are we confident that we should continue to invite the same institutions and the same people to take control of the destiny of this country? I mean, you know, Lord Owen just touched on the defense thing. I found it extraordinary. The other day, Jean-Claude Juncker came out and said, we need a European army, not to use it, you know, but just to show Putin that we're serious. Now, look, I'm no expert on Vladimir Putin's psychology, but I'm guessing that if I were Vladimir Putin, I would be pretty cheered up by the prospect of Jean-Claude Juncker coming along and saying, hey, listen, NATO, don't worry, we'll take this from here, right? I mean, now, what I'm saying is we can see the direction that this is going, because they keep telling us that they want to lead to a common army, a common police force, common tax policy, and all the rest of it, okay? If we vote to stay in, that is not a vote for the status quo. That is getting onto this bus whose direction is very clearly marked on the front of the vehicle. If we want to stay where we are, we get off the bus and we wave it away, we wish it good luck, and we guarantee that we'll always be there cheering them on and as good allies and good friends, but we will not bargain with our democracy.
It's such a central point, that, Nick. If we stay on the bus, do we have to go where the bus appears to be going?
Well, look, I mean, Dan and I even remember once, do you remember? You and I had a blazing row about all of this in the
I do.
aeroplane flying from Strasbourg to Brussels when we were both MEPs together. And you told me then that the federal Europe was going to happen next Tuesday. It didn't happen then. It's not going to happen. These castles on the air. Look, there's
But
been a
Nick, it
huge...
has to happen.
Can I explain why?
Isn't
Can I
it that
explain
his
why?
point is it has to happen. There is a logic that they are
That's what you
fixed
said
on.
about
There
what you said about the social
are
chapter.
separate things. David Owen is quite right to say that the imbalances in the Eurozone will lead and are leading to greater integration in the Eurozone. Of course, he's equally right to say that the United Kingdom, Denmark, Sweden, Eurozone members of the European Union need guarantees that their interests are not going to be prejudiced. And of course, and you can do that. Of course you can do that. We've already got a European Union which is much looser and multifaceted than people think. Some are part of Schengen, some are not. Some are part of the defence union, some are not. Some are part of this measure, some are not. We can do that. It's a much more ingenious Rubik's Cube, if you like, than the straitjacket of federalism that Dan has told me for the last 15 years is going to happen. Has not happened, and I doubt will happen. Can I just say two fundamental things? Firstly, I've heard a lot about how we must release ourselves from the shackles of this ghastly bureaucratic monstrosity. By the way, the European Commission is, I think, a third of the size of just the Department for Work and Pensions. But anyway, some monstrosity that is. But anyway, we must do that so that we can really kind of meet our destiny as free traders on the world stage with China and America. If you speak to Chinese politicians or American leaders, and I've had some very senior American leaders say to me, they cannot comprehend, they literally cannot comprehend why Britain is even contemplating forfeiting our leadership role in our hemisphere. They look from Beijing and Washington and they say, we like you precisely because you can kind of lead and shape the debate in your own neck of the woods. Dan says rather disarmingly, we're in the wrong place. I'm sorry, our tectonic plate is here. It is not going to move to another continent or hemisphere. We are condemned by geography and geology to be a European nation, and we can't simply wish it away. Final word I would say, all of this debate and why it's going to become as wonderfully, I hope, as wonderfully as animated as it has indeed already this afternoon, has become, is because all of this is happening with the backcloth of a very sharp rise in identity politics, us and them politics, nationalism, and outright populism in Europe and indeed across much of the democratic world, whether it's nationalism in Catalonia, independence movements in Scotland, whether it is Pepe Grillo, the populist comedian in Italy, Wim Wilders, the populist right-winger in the Netherlands, the true Finns, Marine Le Pen, the list goes on. We are witnessing a huge change in politics where people who mobilize the public's understandable grievance about what they feel about the world by blaming it on other people, that is on the rise. I think it would be a catastrophic mistake of huge proportions if we were to actually play into that rise of populism and us and them politics by turning our backs on our own European hemisphere. Right. That's just not what is best and greatest about an open-hearted nation such as ours.
Hold those thoughts. Thank you. Let's throw it open. There's someone there already waving, even before there are lights. I can see hands, only just though. We've got microphones, and if you wouldn't mind pausing before the microphone so that the microphone can get to you first. So we've got several people, a cluster of people down here at the front, and someone up there. And well, we've actually got a microphone with someone, so and then we'll bring the microphone down to you. Yeah.
My question is really, what do the panel think about the financial impact if we were to come out? And the way I phrase this is, I'm the daughter of a manufacturer, I work as a lawyer, I'm used to using European law, and I can just imagine if I was suddenly told that we were no longer part of the European Union, you know, within the business we'd have to adjust our policies. Obviously it would happen, it would be fine. Obviously we've got national law that I could still rely on in cases, but what would the cost be to the country of having to do all that, to change our national laws so that they were now only national laws, they weren't using the regulations from Europe, to alter a lot of the things that we have in Europe that have been brought in from Europe, which we may not be necessarily aware of? And is that cost going to outweigh the benefits of not having to pay into Europe?
Can I go to a non-political person for that, or a non-party political person? I mean, from the point of view of farmers dealing with you, I mean, there obviously would be more work to do. It's as simple as that, initially.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many things. You know, will we be guaranteed our labour? I was with the largest soft fruit producer the other day, reliant on 2,000 people to come and do the harvest. That has always been done through the EU because they can move around and they come in for the harvest and they pick the fruit. So is that still going to be available? The whole cost of rewriting the supported payments. You know, we get supported payments out of the EU. Is that going to happen in this country? We haven't prioritised food production at all. So are we going to prioritise food production? Again, a small island nation with a lot of people to feed. What is that going to look like? Is that even going to be there? A huge amount of unanswered questions. I mean, the only policies we've seen are UKIP's policies, and they're written on one side of A4. It would take 7 years, I believe, to pull out. So that's a good amount of time to get this together. But there are just a raft of questions that demand answers. And we haven't even scratched the surface of it.
Just briefly, Dan, how would those years then, how would that be smoothed over? What's your vision of what would actually happen to those businesses who had to make that transition?
Well, we'd be starting with the acquis communautaire as it is. So what we're talking about is turning off the tap. We're talking about no longer having automatically to download every new legal act, however damaging, however restrictive, however expensive. We can then, once we've turned off the tap, decide which bits of the tub we want to bail out and which bits we want to keep. And I come back to saying I think a fairly good model is those countries which are in Western Europe and in the European market but outside it. So Iceland and Switzerland in July of last year signed free trade agreements with China. Obviously, we can't do that. But in most trade arrangements, they go along with the EU. What they have is the capacity to go further when they think the EU is being unduly protectionist. Now, if that suits them, how much more does it suit us as the only European country that sells more outside the EU than to the EU?
Can I answer your question in a different way? We are having a referendum because the present Conservative government fought an election and promised one. Now, if David Cameron and George Osborne are not confident that they could not handle this issue, they shouldn't have called a referendum. And I say this quite bluntly. It's a totally irresponsible act to call a referendum giving a free choice to the British people if you're not confident that if they vote as you don't want them to, you can't handle it. Now, in 1975, at least it was faced up to by Hannan and Wilson. Wilson was not actually really in control of the detail, it was Callaghan. And one of the civil servants came to him and said, you know, we won't need to make changes for some months or even a year. Callaghan said, if they say that they want to leave, we have to be able to act and do so in good faith straight away. I hope that is the same position of the present government. If they lose, they can handle it. And remember this, that though you come out, you have to give 2 years' notice. And that 2 years' notice is mandatory on us. And during that period, many of these questions, which are perfectly reasonable for farmers and industrialists and others, will be answered by the government that has given them this free choice. They're showing no signs of leaving government if they lose this referendum.
No, indeed not. Okay, more people. There's someone down here who's... Yeah, can we bring the microphone along? Sorry, I'll go back to you. I don't want to rip the microphone off because I saw these hands first. It seems only fair. Yeah. Let's maybe have a couple there. If you could pass the microphone behind you, sir, when you finish.
Thank you very much.
Someone over there too, yeah.
Nick Clegg started with the phrase bewildered. I confess I'm confused of Cheltenham. The reason is I hear very many intellectually stimulating, compelling arguments on both sides, and I really don't know what the correct answer is, if there is indeed a correct answer. But there's only a yes or a no, presumably. What faith have you all got that your arguments will be understood by the entire population, or will...
That's a very good point.
Or will we be reduced the day before the referendum of the Sun says yes and the Mail says no, and all this intellectual brain power will be reduced to 2 newspaper headlines?
Yeah. And can you pass the microphone behind you, sir? Yeah. Another one?
It is said, it has been said at a question time that no budget can ever turn Greeks into Germans. Do you think that the EU needs to take cultural differences more into account?
Yep, and one more. Also there, and then I'll come over to...
There has been a lot of talk about Europe currently, but very little talk about Europe in the future, such as the future idea of a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. How gutted do you reckon the UK would be if it left this political union and got pushed out of the single market and then ended up not being inside this transatlantic trade and investment partnership?
Okay, Nick, can you deal first of all with this business of whether the referendum actually will be decided by debates like this, writ large or indeed writ small, or, I don't know, the popularity of the government, all sorts of other things that can intervene and...
Well, the history of referenda is that many people cast their vote not necessarily in response to the exact question on the ballot paper, but a lot of other things come into play. And I have some sympathy with what David says about, holding a referendum without actually thinking through what might happen in this case if the United Kingdom was to leave the European Union. I've heard no answers at all about actually what would happen. The uncertainty would be extraordinary. Forget the internal rules, which the lady there asked about, but we've got 50 trade agreements that we're party to, because they've been negotiated between the European Union and America and China and India and so on. We have to rewrite all of those. That would take years and years and years. But anyway, on the referendum, I think one of the things I'm assuming you've all bought tickets to come here because you're interested in this subject. I'll tell you something. I'm sure Dan can and David can testify to this as long-standing politicians themselves. Whilst all of us here might care passionately about this subject, do you know what? Lots of people don't really care. No, and this is the big difference with the Scottish referendum. I think pretty well everyone, every man and woman in the Scottish referendum was really fired up and got really informed. I have been a constituency MP for South West Sheffield for the last 10 years. I have been knocking on thousands and thousands and thousands of doors, day in, day out, week in, week out for that decade. I can honestly tell you, at no point did I ever return to my constituency office and say, the thing that's really coming up on the doorstep that people really, really care about is Europe. They care about the NHS, about jobs, about crime, about all sorts of other things. It is actually never, even when the Westminster Village and the media and the political elite has been obsessed about it, actually featured very, very high in people's everyday preoccupations. It's always been an absolute internal obsession for the Conservative Party. That, of course, is like why the reason the referendum was held in the early 70s, because of internal party difficulties. The government of the day exports its own internal traumas and asks the rest of us to make up its mind for it. That's in effect what's happening. Anyway, we are where we are. That's why we're going to have the referendum. Yeah. But the point I want to make to you is that you're right to say that this issue, certainly more than the Scottish issue, I think could be much more susceptible to all sorts of sort of mood swings and extraneous sort of influences, because quite a lot of people who will decide this referendum, and perfectly understandably why they feel like that, don't care as much as many of us here this afternoon.
Dan, can you deal with the cultural question? Because it is an interesting one, isn't it? This question of whether Europe has been, it would be a better place. The European Union would be so much improved if it had a greater kind of sense of cultural differences around Europe.
Well, indeed. I mean, if Europe were a single people, then a European democracy would be a possibility. But if you try and create a government where there is no nation, you find that it has no loyalty, no affinity, no community of identity. You can't create a democracy without the demos, without the unit with which we identify when we use the word we. If you take the demos out of a democracy, you're left only with the kratos. With the power of a system that has to compel by law what it can't ask in the name of patriotism. The reality is very few people, if any, feel, except in Brussels, feel European in the same sense that somebody might feel Hungarian or Portuguese or Swedish. But I just want to come back to the point about
very
people
briefly,
care, which I think is really important. Europe, the EU, touches almost every field of domestic life. So if you ask people in the abstract, are you interested in what's happening across the Channel and all the corruption and so on, of course, that comes fairly low. Right? But when you look at how much it affects our daily lives, right? The weekly versus fortnightly recycling is actually the landfill directive. The rigmarole you have to go through with all your old utilities bills to open a bank account is actually the money laundering directive. I am now obliged by EU law to carry my kids around in car seats until they reach a certain age or a certain minimum height. I've been looking forward to discarding the wretched yogurt-encrusted blobs at a much earlier stage than that, and I speak obviously of the car seats, not the point is not whether that's a good or a bad policy. The point is, how on earth have we reached the stage where that kind of issue has to be imposed uniformly on 500 million Europeans? Can't we decide issues like that closer to the people that they affect?
We've got a microphone over there. Yes, madam. No, it's a gentleman.
A question for
Go for it.
Mr. Hannan, chiefly, if I may. In his glance at the trade figures this morning, which does seem a little bit last minute, if I may say so, did he not observe that while indeed if our percentage of exports to the EU has diminished by 3 or 4 percentage points over 20 years, in real and absolute terms, and it's not surprising given the growth of the BRIC markets, they have in fact risen. And going along with that, I speak as an exporter of British goods and services, will you not agree that it can only be more difficult to export British goods and services, and that represents therefore our balance of payments deficit, perhaps the biggest economic problem we face at the moment? It can only be more difficult if we were to leave the EU.
Dan.
Well, I'm going to say it one last time. There is a pan-European free market. What we're talking about, as Nick says, is losing our minority vote over the setting of common rules. But no one is suggesting that our market access would be impacted one way or the other. So the trade-off is this. You lose a minority vote over the setting of rules, much of which, as Nick admitted, was already done, was, as he said, a British creation done by 1992, in exchange for the ability to sign bilateral deals with all the bits of the world that are actually growing in a way that the EFTA countries do. Now, ask yourselves this. If we were not now in the European Union, right, given the way the economy is panning out, given the way Nick says we're tectonically in Europe, yeah, but you know, we're in an age when geographical proximity has never mattered less. The internet makes it as easy for a company in my constituency to trade with New Zealand as to trade, in fact, easier, because the Kiwi company, unlike the French one, is English-speaking, common law, uses the same accountancy system. If there's a dispute, it's arbitrated in a way that they both recognize. You know, we would not now be making the decision that we made out of despair in the early 70s to go in with what looked like being a successful economic bloc on our doorstep when we look around and we survey the big picture, which is that every continent on the planet is experiencing economic growth except one.
Briefly.
But Dan, do you really think that we would have less regulation? You know, we are the gold platers of all regulation. How are we going to manage that?
I don't want to bring powers back from Brussels and then leave them festering in Whitehall. I want to push them downwards and outwards
do you see that
to
changing?
local council. Yeah, I do. I think the mood in Britain is towards localism, towards the decentralisation of power. I think the government of which Nick was a member made substantial progress towards more local democracy, more autonomy. But there is a fundamental tension between wanting to push powers down in Britain and at the same time pushing them up to the European Commission.
Back out to the microphone there. Yeah, right. Oh, okay. I was actually pointing behind you, but you've found someone there. Yes, okay. And then we'll come back to the end of the hall, I think. Yes.
Listening to Dan, I think there's a certain elasticity in your timeframes there. You've said that, yes, the EU currently is a very substantial economic power, but it's declining. You then said, it doesn't matter because we are the 5th biggest economy in the world. But we've no mention on the trend for the UK. And that seems to me is the real question here. This isn't about Europe, this is about the UK and about England and about our place in the world and how we see that developing. Do you really believe that this little wet and windy island will remain the 5th biggest economy in the world while the rest of the world is levelling up with globalisation? That's the question.
Hold that thought, that question. Or can we go back? There's several people right in the middle here. There's no one at the very back who's very interested. Maybe that's why you're sitting at the very. Yes, there is. Sorry. So there's a. So if someone can go up the stairs, that we get at least one person from the back of the audience. I've just got, you know, impartiality on the brain. Really, I feel that we need to go. Yeah. Even if we ignore most of you, which I fear we will, because there's an awful lot of people who want to speak, we'll at least go around the hall. Yes, sir.
It ties in with that in a way. This has been a very hard-nosed debate about economies. That's the basis we entered. I always feel it's a wonderful thing that whilst my grandfather fought in a European-inspired war or a European-centric war, my father did also, that I have never been called on to fight, and hopefully my son never will be too. I don't know what the European Union's contributed to that, but and whether there is more contribution by NATO. I'd be interested to hear what Lord Owen says. But I do think it's something you need to take into account, and there is room for a bit of heart as well as head.
Yeah. Okay, hold that thought. And someone right at the very back. Yes. Here we go.
Hi. When the when the pro-Europe campaigners are talking about how one of the biggest obstacles to leaving is that there'll be a transition process that'll take a few years, is it not the case that if we do stay in, there'll be a kind of negotiation process anyway, and that kind of makes that argument a moot point?
Okay, to our panel, we've got literally a minute and a half, I think, left, and we are going to have to finish on time. Take any of those thoughts, or indeed any other thoughts that you want to finish with. Nick.
Well, first, I strongly agree with the gentleman who said, of course, this is, it is head and heart, isn't it? It's not one or the other. And I don't think, I've heard some people sort of claim the European Union is the reason we've had an unparalleled period of peace. I think that's a slightly silly claim, but it is clearly also true that jaw is better than war. And you know, particularly for older generations who are not represented here at all, by the way. You're all such a youthful, vigorous audience.
They never are in Cheltenham.
And you know, I mean, all of our families have been. I think of my dad's family. My grandmother came from sort of revolution and war-torn Russia. My mother spent her formative early years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Indonesia. All of our families have been marked and scarred one way or another by the blood-soaked European history. And it is an extraordinary achievement that out of that rubble of that conflict, we have created this highly integrated economic area in Europe, and that is all to the good. My final thought is this: a lot of people have talked about trade here in the world more generally. If you are Chinese or Brazilian or Indian or Indonesian or indeed American, if you're one of the big powers outside Europe, and Britain were to come out of the European Union, and Britain were then to say, we now want to tear up the agreements we've had with the European Union to allow British companies to trade with Indonesia, with China, with in India, with America and so on, and we want to negotiate better terms. Just ask yourself, does one seriously think that these hard-headed trade, and in a previous incarnation, well before politics, I worked as a trade negotiator, and these people are absolutely rock hard. Does anyone seriously think that we're going to strike a better deal as a country of 60 million rather than as the world's largest trading bloc of 500 million citizens? Of course not. Of course not. This idea that there is this nirvana out there where everyone will do exactly what we want throughout the whole of the rest of the world by recreating something purely on our terms, I think is a profoundly naive misreading of the hard-headed nature of modern politics.
David Owen, is it? Of course not.
I think that undoubtedly France and Germany have come closer as a result of the European Common Market and now European Union. And I think that's a positive bonus and a good thing. But I think peace in Europe was actually Marshall Plan, the US Secretary of State and former general, and the existence of NATO, without which I think we would not possibly have seen the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall coming down. So we need them both, and under all circumstances we're going to have European cooperation, continued trade in Europe, and good relations. The question is very much more, as you look at all of this, pros and cons, pluses and minuses. And this has been very clearly shown. You have the Eurozone, which is a disaster, and it has to be changed, and it's in our interest to change it. If it is not changed, then we would not continue with it. And this whole idea that borders don't matter, that you can have free movements of people and labor, is, I believe, premature at most and very dangerous at the moment. And we are seeing the breakup of that whole idea. The problem with Europe is pretension. It pretends to be what it's not. It is not a country, but it constantly tries to place itself more and more as a country and fails when it tries to.
Dan.
I share Lord Owen's sense of the history. I think it makes... I mean, ask this question. Are we right to see the European Union as the cause of peace in Europe? Or doesn't it make more sense to see it as a consequence of a European peace that was based on the defeat of fascism, the spread of democracy, and the NATO alliance? Or ask this question. Look at the impact of jamming different peoples together through the euro and through the Schengen zone. Look at how German newspapers now refer to Greece and vice versa. Would you say that this project of pushing these countries together is soothing or stoking national antagonisms? It is perfectly possible to live together as good neighbors rather than as squabbling tenants. Very quickly on, are we still going to be the fifth largest economy outside? Well, according to current trends, we are going to overtake Germany at some point in the 2030s. We're going to be the fourth largest economy. We've got to get out of this kind of this habit of declinism that we formed in the 70s. We are exporting vodka to Poland. We're exporting tea to China. We're exporting kayaks to the Inuit. We are a tremendously successful trading people. We should think more widely than what's happening. Yes, we may have passed our greatest point, but there's still a lot left. You know, though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven,
Enough.
that which we are, we are.
Richard, are you not, finally, in 30 seconds, are you not fired up by that?
I like what the gentleman said about being confused of Cheltenham, and that's the reality of how it is. There's a third of us that are for in, currently. There's a third, like Dan, who are for out, and there's a third that's undecided. So it's actually the confused of Cheltenham that are going to decide this. Yeah. Is it going to come down to these paper headlines? I don't know. It depends how you make your decisions. I always start with, go back to first basics and principles. Firstly, be wary of the eternal risk of thinking that the grass is always greener on the other side. Most often in life, it is better to stick with what you're doing and do a better job rather than just believe that if you suddenly make a massive wholesale change, it'll all be much better.
You would have stuck with your job then in the bank or wherever you were, wouldn't you?
From the age of eight, I wanted to set up a business, and I just stuck with it. I had businesses that failed, and I kept going, and I kept going. So I'm all about sticking. Making better. Secondly, look at the way that the world is and the way it's going. Look at the geopolitics. Do you think Putin? I think Putin is rubbing his hands with glee with the idea that we're going to be infighting amongst ourselves. Right. That is the dumbest thing that we do. Look at geopolitics. And then, in terms of our future generations, the biggest risks: climate change and terrorism. Two things that we will be much better at tackling together rather than separate.
Minute, do you want to...
Yes, please. Yeah.
2 seconds.
2 seconds, that's unfair. That's a bias. Just very quickly,
Life isn't fair.
Small island nation, and given as Nick says that we can't move our tectonic plate, when you all drive home, when you all go out of here, just north, south, east or west, look around you. You know, farmers have to be at the heart, I believe, of food security, water resource, climate change. It's got to be managed. I applaud this debate. I hope we'll have a lot more of it, because there's a real danger, as this gentleman said here, that this debate will come down to immigration and regulation, and there is so much more at stake.
We have crashed the pips, ladies and gentlemen. We're well over. A round of applause, please, for all of our panellists. Thank you so much.